You're not irreplaceable. Those were the last words he said to me that Friday morning. Cold, measured, delivered right after dumping the workload of 3 laid-off colleagues on my desk. No warning, no conversation, just a decision made behind closed doors and delivered like a punishment. My name is Kayla Monroe, and if you've ever worked at a company that calls itself a family, then you probably know how that story ends. Your family is the one left behind, and you're the one forced to clean up the mess. That day, I was wearing my crisp white dress shirt, the one I usually save for client presentations. But nobody told me there'd be a silent execution happening in the office that morning. No meetings, no memos, no goodbyes, just Slack statuses going dark, auto replies kicking in, and empty chairs where friends used to sit, as if they'd never been there at all. I walked into the office at 7:30 a.m. and immediately felt it. Something was off. People avoiding eye contact, whispers in the hallway, a kind of tension that buzzed in the walls like faulty wiring. Minutes later, the email hit. CentriCore is initiating a strategic restructuring. Impacted employees will be notified individually. I wasn't one of them. My name wasn't on the list. But just as I exhaled, Logan, our freshly promoted department head, walked into my office and handed me a new assignment list. 3 roles, 3 very different jobs, 3 workloads that once took 150 hours a week combined. And now just me. 1 person, 1 brain, 2 hands. When I looked at him, stunned, still processing, he didn't flinch. He simply said, "If you can handle it, great. If not, well, you know where the door is." And then came the line that lit the fuse. "You're not irreplaceable, Caleb. Don't forget that." I didn't say anything. I just nodded, got up, and walked out of that meeting room. But something inside me had shifted. A switch had flipped. I knew right then I wouldn't just sit back and take it. I wasn't going to silently carry the burden of 3 people who had been cut loose without dignity. I wasn't going to let this man crush another soul under his polished shoes. You know, sometimes power doesn't come from shouting or slamming fists. Sometimes it comes from calculated silence, from sleepless nights spent planning, and from a decision forged in the furnace of months, maybe years, of being underestimated. This is the story of how I turned that moment into a reckoning. How I made the man who said I was replaceable walk away in silence. That night, I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly through the streets of Austin, letting the city's neon heartbeat blur past my windows. I ended up at this old diner I used to go to during my college days. The kind of place that still had laminated menus, cracked leather booths, and bottomless coffee that tasted like burnt ambition. I sat there for hours, replaying everything. Logan's voice, that spreadsheet, the hollow silence of the office after the purge. I didn't touch the grilled cheese I ordered. My mind was racing too fast. Not with anger, at least not yet, but with this overwhelming question. What the hell just happened? Logan Barrett wasn't always this cold. I remembered when he joined CentriCore. He was sharp, driven, even likable. We weren't exactly friends, but we'd shared beers at offsites, traded book recommendations, and once bonded over fixing a production outage at 2 a.m. He was ambitious, sure, but so was everyone in tech. That wasn't a sin. The transformation came later, after he got fast-tracked by the board, after the promotion. Suddenly, he spoke in nothing but bullet points and boardroom buzzwords. Human empathy had been replaced with metrics and deliverables. That week's layoffs weren't just cruel, they were reckless. And I had been handed a gun with the trigger already pulled. I was expected to keep things running while bleeding out internally. When I got home close to midnight, my roommate Darren was still up playing some late-night FIFA match. He looked up when I walked in, eyes narrowing at my expression. "You look like you fought a bear and lost." "Worse," I muttered. "I fought corporate America, and I'm still in the ring." I told him everything. The layoffs, the triple workload, Logan's ultimatum. Darren listened silently, then leaned back, folding his arms. "So what now? You gonna quit?" I didn't answer, not because I didn't know, but because I did. The plan? By morning, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to quit, not yet. Quitting would have been too simple, too neat. No, I was going to do something better. I was going to expose him. The next few days, I became a ghost with purpose. I started digging. I had access to logs, reports, client tickets, and sprint retros from the last 18 months. And what I found wasn't just incompetence, it was deception. Logan had been gaming the system to meet his KPIs. I uncovered how he'd reclassified critical bugs as non-issues to hit project deadlines. I found Slack messages where he pressured junior devs to work nights without overtime. There were emails where he promised security features to clients that never made it to the roadmap. Worse yet, he buried at least 2 formal complaints from our team, one related to burnout, the other to verbal harassment during a sprint review. And then there were the spreadsheets. Logan had retroactively altered forecast numbers in our Q2 deck, the very ones sent to our investors. Each piece of evidence I found added a new brick to the case I was building. A quiet rage was taking root in me, but so was clarity. I created 2 documents. The first was a transition feasibility assessment, a formal analysis of the workload Logan had dumped on me. It included time breakdowns, dependency trees, and risk evaluations. It made it mathematically obvious that one person could not handle that work without sacrificing quality, safety, and sanity. The second document was far more dangerous. It was a 17-page internal report addressed to Centricor's board of directors. The subject line read, "Systemic negligence in product management under Logan Barrett. Confidential submission." Every claim was supported by screenshots, links, or first-hand accounts. I anonymized my sources but kept timestamps and Slack threads intact. It was a surgical strike, not driven by revenge, but by truth. I also reached out to Trish, Ian, and Mel, 3 of the engineers who had been laid off. Trish had just landed an offer from a cybersecurity firm in California. Ian was still job hunting. Mel was freelancing and bitter. When I shared my plan, all 3 of them offered their support. "You're crazy," Mel told me, but also kind of legend. The confrontation. Monday morning came. I arrived earlier than usual. I wore the navy blue button-down I save for interviews. Clean, sharp, professional. The kind that says, "I'm not here to play." I walked straight to Logan's office. He wasn't in yet. Of course he wasn't. He never arrived before 9. I slipped the first envelope onto his chair. It had his name on it. Inside, the transition analysis. Cold, clinical, damning. I sat at my desk and waited. At 9:07, he arrived. I heard his voice echoing through the open office as he barked into his phone. Then silence. Then rapid footsteps. He exploded out of his office. "Caleb, what the hell is this?" he snapped, waving the document like it was on fire. I stood slowly and turned. The entire floor had gone silent. "That," I said, loud and clear, "is my professional assessment of the workload you assigned me." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You put in writing that this job takes 3 people. Are you insane?" "No, I'm honest, which is more than I can say for you." He hissed, "Lower your voice." I stood taller. "No," I said, "let them hear." He dragged me into his office, slamming the door. He opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. "You want to talk about deliverables? About expectations? You violated every rule in the book, overworking your team, lying to investors, falsifying metrics." He went pale. "What are you talking about?" I reached into my bag and handed him the second envelope. His name wasn't on this one. It was addressed to the board of directors, confidential. He tore it open, scanned the first page, then the second. I watched the blood drain from his face. "No, you wouldn't dare send this." "I already did," I said. "At 8:45 this morning." He dropped into his chair like someone had cut his strings. "You're done, Logan." The silence in Logan's office was suffocating. He stared at the report in his hands, jaw clenched so tightly I could see the vein pulsing in his temple. He didn't flip past the second page. He didn't have to. The executive summary alone laid out enough firepower to ignite a full-blown investigation. Every misstep, every covered-up incident, every shortcut he'd taken in the name of efficiency. Finally, he looked up. "You're sabotaging the company." "No," I said calmly. "I'm saving it from you. You have no idea what kind of pressure I'm under. The board wants miracles, not excuses." And instead of being honest, I said, You turned your team into collateral damage. You chose fear over leadership. You chose numbers over people. You just burned every bridge you had here. No, Logan. You set them on fire. I just made sure the smoke was visible. He stood up, still holding the envelope, and leaned across the desk. Do you really think the board will take your side over mine? I've been delivering results for 2 years. I didn't flinch. Not when they read the raw logs. Not when they see the bug tracking reports, the missed SLA deadlines, the client churn data. Not when they realize your numbers were cooked. They'll see who's been propping up this department and who's been quietly running it into the ground. He stepped back, rattled. You're bluffing. I'm not. You'll see. I turned to leave. As I reached the door, I paused and looked over my shoulder. Oh, and Logan, check your inbox. There's a copy of the report in there, too, and one with legal. Just in case. I walked out into the open office, 100 invisible eyes following me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The silence behind me was louder than any applause. Back at my desk, I closed every file, shut down my terminal, and pulled a flash drive from my drawer. My projects, documentation, transition notes, I'd left everything perfectly organized. I wasn't just walking away. I was handing over a system that would work, even if I wasn't the one driving it. At 10:03 a.m., I stepped into the elevator for what I thought might be the last time. 2 days later, it didn't take long. The board didn't respond publicly, of course not. But the whispers started circulating within 48 hours. First came the closed-door meeting. Then came the data verification team that arrived unannounced from headquarters. Then the security audit. By Thursday, Logan was no longer leading stand-ups. By Friday, his office was empty. No dramatic exit. No speech. Just gone. Someone said they saw him packing his things after hours, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Someone else claimed he was reassigned to a non-client-facing role pending internal review. I didn't care. It wasn't about watching him fall. It was about the silence that came after. That sharp, still space where fear used to sit. The offer. The following Monday, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown San Diego number. I almost ignored it until the voice on the other end said, Mr. Monroe, this is Rachel Lavin from Cybercore Labs. We received a strong recommendation from one of our partner firms, and we're wondering if you'd be open to a conversation. Cybercore, our biggest competitor, a company I knew well, not just by name, but by culture. They paid well. They respected their engineers, and they were hungry. We set up a meeting. By Wednesday, I was flown out for a discreet interview. And by Friday, I had an offer on the table. Director of System Strategy. Twice my CentriCore salary. Equity. Full team autonomy. I stared at the numbers, then looked around my apartment. Darren asleep on the couch. Our half-working espresso machine humming like it was powered by spite and caffeine fumes. I smiled, but I wasn't done yet. I reached out to Trish, Ian, and Mel. Cybercore has 3 openings. You in? They didn't hesitate. I referred them, advocated for them. By the time my onboarding was complete, they were already flying in for final interviews. The next message I sent was to 4 of our highest-profile clients. Those I knew had been frustrated with CentriCore's declining service. All I said was, if you're looking for stability and vision, let me know. New things are coming. Within a week, 2 of them replied. The new beginning. My first day at Cybercore was nothing like CentriCore. The office was quiet, focused, professional, but human. I was given a tour, introduced with genuine warmth, and handed a roadmap that actually reflected reality. No inflated projections. No impossible timelines. Just ambitious goals backed by real people. In my second week, I gave a presentation titled Rebuilding from the Inside Out. It wasn't about tech. It was about culture. About what happens when leadership forgets that people build systems, not the other way around. After the session, my new VP pulled me aside. Your story, that thing with Logan. You ever think about writing about it? I shook my head. I didn't do it for drama. I did it because no one else would. He smiled. That's exactly why people should hear it. 6 months later, CentriCore was acquired, not by Cybercore, but by a larger consultancy firm that specialized in buying distressed assets. I saw the headlines on LinkedIn. Merger, integration, leadership transition. Everyone knew what it really meant. Layoffs. A full reset. I reached out to a few old colleagues who were still hanging on. Some are bitter, some relieved, some just tired. I gave them referrals where I could. Meanwhile, my team at CyberCore was thriving. We built Phoenix, a system audit platform that reduced client onboarding time by 43%. It won us 2 government contracts in Q1. And me? I finally slept through the night again. For the first few weeks, I was riding a high. CyberCore was everything CentriCore pretended to be. Focused, efficient, ethical. People respected deadlines because leadership respected them. I had a full team of senior engineers who didn't need to be micromanaged. We worked like clockwork, agile in the best sense of the word, solving real problems without layers of performative bureaucracy. But then, somewhere around the second month, reality started whispering to me in familiar tones. The whispers didn't come as backstabbing or chaos. No, they were subtler, more insidious. An engineer pulling me aside to say, "Hey, I've been working 60-hour weeks for 3 straight sprints. Can we look at the load?" A product manager quietly admitting they'd fudged a burn-down chart to avoid scrutiny. A junior dev missing daily stand-ups because she was terrified of making mistakes in front of senior leadership. And just like that, I realized something chilling. I was the boss now. The very role I'd fought so hard to challenge, I was now living in. I remember staring at my reflection in the darkened glass of the office window one evening. My shirt sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, coffee cold and untouched. I looked tired, not because of stress, but because of the weight of choices. Choices that affected people, not just deliverables. You don't get to hide in the code when you're at the top. You become the narrative everyone else lives inside of. The first test. It started with our biggest project, Phoenix Protocol. We were ahead of schedule, but a key component, automated compliance integration, was riddled with edge case bugs. My engineering lead, Priya, wanted to delay the demo by 2 weeks to ensure we didn't ship something half-baked. But our client, a federal contractor, was pushing for a live demo on the original date. In my CentriCore days, Logan would have pushed the product through, bugs and all, then blamed QA or DevOps when it crashed. I stared at the email for 20 minutes before responding. Then I called Priya. "Push the demo," I said. "You sure?" "Yeah. If we lose the client, that's on me. But we're not becoming them." She was quiet for a beat. Then, "Thanks, Caleb." It was a small decision, but it felt seismic, like drawing a line in the sand against everything I used to resent. And to my surprise, the client respected our transparency. They agreed to the delay. In the feedback form after launch, their director wrote, "This is the most honest technical partnership we've had in 5 years." The ghost of Logan. Ironically, it wasn't failure that haunted me. It was the fear of becoming the villain in someone else's story. Late one evening, I got an email from a junior dev named Theo. It was just a few lines. "Hey, Caleb, I know you're busy, but just want to say thanks. You actually listen. That's rare." I stared at that message longer than I cared to admit. Because years ago, I'd written a nearly identical note to a manager named Julia at my first startup, right before she burned out and quit. She had been kind, competent, overworked, and tragically replaceable. I printed Theo's message and pinned it behind my monitor. A reminder, not of success, but of responsibility. A visitor from the past. 3 months into my new role, I got an unexpected LinkedIn message. "Logan Barrett has viewed your profile." It sent a ripple down my spine. I clicked through. His title had changed again. Strategic Consultant Independent. No company listed. No connections in common. Just a washed-out corporate headshot and a list of vague achievements. I closed the tab. 10 minutes later, another message arrived. This time in my inbox. "Hey, Caleb. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. About how it ended. If you're ever up for a coffee, I'd like to talk. No agenda. Just 2 people who've seen the fire from both sides." I didn't reply, not out of hatred, but because I wasn't sure I was ready to hear what he had to say. Or worse, ready to understand it. Building forward. 6 months passed. Phoenix Protocol launched ahead of our competitors. We landed 3 new enterprise clients. My team grew from 12 to 24. And one Friday, after back-to-back sprints and 4 nights eating takeout at the office, I shut my laptop and said, No more hero culture. We instituted mandatory offline hours, built a rotational on-call system, launched a mentorship initiative for junior devs. The office vibe shifted. Slowly but noticeably, people smiled more, laughed in hallways again, brought in bagels on Fridays. And that's when it hit me. This was the revenge I'd always wanted. Not the dramatic downfall of someone like Logan. Not the LinkedIn gossip or boardroom shakeups. But this quiet, sustainable, principled progress. Creating the workplace we all pretended existed. Building it from the ruins of the one that didn't. The legacy. One evening, Darren came over with takeout and a bottle of whiskey. To your 6-month mark, he said. Still sane. Still standing. We ate on the balcony. Below us, the city buzzed, oblivious to my tiny revolution. You know, he said between bites, I thought you'd lose yourself in this job. I almost did. What stopped you? I thought for a moment. I remembered what it felt like to be voiceless. To be the guy doing 3 people's jobs while someone else took the credit. And I remembered how much it meant the first time someone listened. He raised his glass. To legacy, he said. I clinked mine against his. Not legacy, I corrected. To accountability. It had been almost a year since that day. The one where I'd left Logan's office and never looked back. A full year since the envelope, the report, the storm I'd lit on fire with calm hands and calculated words. Life had moved forward, slowly at first, then all at once. But one evening in late fall, with Austin wrapped in that rare, quiet cold, a familiar name reappeared in my inbox. Subject, coffee? The message was short. Too short. Caleb, hope you're well. I'm passing through Austin next week. Would you be open to grabbing a coffee? No agenda. Just a conversation. Logan. I stared at the email longer than I meant to. My first reaction was to delete it. My second was to forward it to Darren with the caption, Guess who's back from the dead? But I didn't. I closed my laptop and went for a walk instead. The streets were unusually empty. A light drizzle clung to the air, turning everything silver and still. I found myself outside that old diner, the one I used to haunt when the world felt too heavy. I sat at a booth, ordered black coffee, and tried to ask myself honestly, what do I want from this? Revenge was already done. Reputation rebuilt. My team was thriving. Logan had no power over me anymore. So why was I still hesitating? Because somewhere in some deep, unlit hallway of my memory, he was still standing over that desk, saying, You're not irreplaceable. That was what I needed closure on. I replied with 2 words. Let's talk. We agreed to meet the following Wednesday. Neutral ground. A cafe on the east side, halfway between downtown and nowhere. The day arrived with a soft, overcast sky, the kind that made everything feel like a memory. I arrived early, ordered my usual, and chose a seat near the window. I didn't wear anything special. No power shirt, no symbolic outfit. Just jeans, a flannel, and the calm of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. Logan walked in 5 minutes late. He looked different, not dramatically, but the kind of different that comes from long nights and quiet regret. His hair was shorter, the gray showing more. His posture was softer. There was no briefcase, no watch, no aura of authority. Just a man in a dark coat who looked like he wasn't sure he should be there. He spotted me, nodded, and walked over. Caleb, he said carefully. Logan. He gestured to the seat across from me. This okay? I nodded. We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that isn't awkward so much as unfinished. I appreciate you meeting me, he said finally. I almost didn't. I figured. Another pause. He glanced out the window, then back at me. I've replayed that day in my head more times than I can count, he said. The envelope. The fallout. Everything. Have you? I asked, voice neutral. He nodded. At first, I was angry. Thought you betrayed the company. Thought you were out for blood. But after the noise died down, I started asking myself different questions. Like what? He looked at me, really looked. Like why it took someone calling me out for me to even notice how bad things had gotten. I didn't respond. Not yet. I was in survival mode. Caleb, I thought I was protecting the company by pushing people. I thought being a leader meant being strong, decisive, even ruthless when necessary. And instead you became someone who destroyed his own team, I said evenly. You stopped listening. You stopped caring. He didn't deny it, just dropped his gaze and nodded. I know, he said quietly, and I'm not here to make excuses. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. The words hung there between us, fragile and unpolished. I know it won't fix anything, he added, but it's the truth. I was wrong. I saw people as numbers. I ignored warning signs. And you were right to do what you did. I took a sip of coffee, giving the moment space to breathe. You hurt a lot of people, I said. Not just me. Trish, Ian, Mel. You turned a place that used to feel like home into something cold. That doesn't get erased with an apology. I don't expect it to, he replied. I wanted you to know that I see it now. A silence stretched between us, but it wasn't bitter. It was tired, maybe real. He told me he'd been consulting with early-stage startups, helping young teams avoid the mistakes he made. Less prestige, more meaning. It sounded genuine. Whether it was redemption or reinvention, I wasn't sure. Maybe even he didn't know. I asked him something I hadn't planned to. What would you have done differently? He blinked, thought about it, then said, I would have trusted people more. Let go of the idea that control equals strength. And I would have remembered what it feels like to be on the other side of the power dynamic. I nodded. That's a good start. He gave a small smile, hesitant but real. I still think about the look on your face that day, he said. When I told you you weren't irreplaceable, I thought I was motivating you. You were breaking me, I replied. But the funny thing is, you were also waking me up. He didn't say anything to that. Eventually, we stood. He offered his hand. This time, I shook it. Take care of yourself, Logan. You too, he said. You built something better. I see that now. And then he was gone. I stood there for a moment, watching him walk away, feeling lighter. Not triumphant. Not vindicated. Just free. Because closure doesn't always come with fireworks or applause. Sometimes, it's just a quiet morning in a half-empty cafe where the person who once dismantled your dignity looks you in the eye and admits they were wrong. And in that moment, you realize you no longer need to carry their shadow. It began with a spreadsheet. Funny how these things always do. A resource allocation model had landed in my inbox on a quiet Thursday morning, sent from our finance liaison, Gina, with a polite note. Initial budget compression strategy for FY next quarter. Let's discuss before next exec review. I opened the file, sipping lukewarm coffee, already preparing to skim. But halfway through the third tab, I froze. There they were, 4 red-highlighted roles in our infrastructure team, labeled Candidates for Headcount Reduction Q1. I read the line again. Candidates for Headcount Reduction. There was no mention of names. Just role titles, salary bands, project alignments, and one brutal column, impact score. It was clinical, efficient, bloodless. I scrolled down. The last tab was labeled Projected Savings Scenario. A number glared back at me. Mid-6 figures. Neat. Digestible. Human lives, summarized into decimals and margins. I leaned back in my chair, the edges of the screen blurring slightly. This wasn't Logan's work. It wasn't anyone's malice. It was process. That scared me more. That night, I stayed in the office long after the lights dimmed. My team had gone home. The cleaning crew passed by with quiet carts and slow brooms. I opened every single document related to that proposal. The finance models, the headcount logs, the hiring pipeline freeze draft. I traced how we had arrived here. And then I stared at my reflection in the glass again, just as I had months ago. This time, the man staring back looked different. Not tired, not angry, haunted, because I had a choice to make. If I approved the proposal, I could defend it as responsible, strategic. I'd be protecting the company's long-term growth, securing higher profitability, and technically, no one would say I did anything wrong. But I knew what it felt like to be on the other side of that spreadsheet. I knew the sound of an unopened email that meant you didn't matter anymore. And now, I was the one with the pen. The ripple effect of power is never obvious when you're drowning in it. It's when the tide pulls back and you're standing dry, clean, in control, that you feel its weight. I closed the file, and I did something radical. I picked up the phone and called Ravi, our infrastructure lead. Hey, I said, you busy? Just finishing up some automation scripts. What's up? I need to ask you a tough question. If you had to defend your team's existence to the board, what would you say? He was silent for a beat. Then, I'd say we're the people who make sure the plane flies, even when the passengers only care about the in-flight movie. I exhaled through a laugh. That's a pretty good answer. I didn't get into this to make anyone rich, Caleb, but I believe in building things that don't break when they scale. Would you be willing to show me that? Not just say it, prove it with metrics, forecasts, dependencies. You want a war plan? I want the truth. You'll have it by Monday. By Monday, Ravi gave me more than a plan. He gave me a rebuttal. His analysis showed that cutting even one of the roles would create a cascading risk across 6 client-facing systems. He included timelines, stress models, even error simulations. It was sharp, professional, unignorable. I brought it to Gina first. She listened, brows furrowed. So you're rejecting the reduction scenario? I'm replacing it with this. She reviewed it again, carefully this time. I'll admit, this is solid. But leadership might still push back. Let them, I said. I'll take the questions. I'll defend the team. She smiled, thinly but genuinely. You're not like the others, you know. I wasn't sure that was a compliment, but I nodded. And when the next leadership review came, I stood in front of that long glass table, a dozen executives lined up like judges, and I said, we don't cut infrastructure. We invest in it. One of them raised an eyebrow. At what cost? I didn't flinch. At the cost of not making the same mistake our competitors already did, undervaluing the quiet parts of the system until they break loudly. There was murmuring, some nods, some resistance, but the plan passed. No cuts, no layoffs, no red highlighted rows. When I got back to my floor, Ravi was waiting by the break room with a donut in one hand and a raised brow. You kept us intact. You kept us intact, I corrected. That night, I sat on my balcony, the city sprawling beneath me in a soft web of light. Professor, my ever-judgmental cat, curled on the windowsill behind me, tail flicking with habitual contempt. I thought about power again. How it's not a moment. It's a pattern. Not about whether you can make hard decisions, but how you make them, who you call, what questions you ask, how well you sleep after. And I realized something. Logan hadn't failed because he made hard decisions. He failed because he made them in isolation, because he thought leadership meant knowing everything, owning everything, and being feared enough to never be challenged. But true leadership? It's knowing when to shut up and listen, when to ask for help, when to admit that a spreadsheet doesn't tell the whole story. A week later, Theo, the same junior dev who once thanked me for listening, slid a note onto my desk. It wasn't long. Thanks for keeping the lights on, even when the switch was in your hands. I kept that note, right next to the one I printed all those months ago. Not because I needed the praise, but because I needed the reminder. Every ripple starts with a decision. And now, I understood mine could either erode trust or build a legacy. It was a quiet Sunday morning when the letter arrived. Not a metaphorical one. A real letter. Ink on thick paper, folded with care, postmarked from Seattle. No return address, but I knew the handwriting the moment I saw it. Precise, slightly tilted to the right. The way she used to write grocery lists on the whiteboard. The way she'd jot down lines of poetry on the backs of receipts when the words came to her in a rush. Her name was Maya. She hadn't been part of this story so far. Not because she wasn't important, but because some chapters you keep closed until you're ready to bleed again. Maya and I met long before Centricore, before promotions and office betrayals and mission statements. We met when all I owned was a futon and a secondhand laptop, and she was a freelance illustrator who painted on the backs of pizza boxes when canvases were too expensive. We were young, hungry, brave in the ways only people without health insurance can be. And then life got louder. I got promoted. She got offered an art residency abroad. I told her to go. She told me she would. We kissed in a train station like the world was ending. And then we drifted. No big fights. No betrayals, just a long, slow unraveling that neither of us had the courage to stop. That had been 3 years ago, and now this letter. I held it for a while before opening it, ran my fingers along the edge. I don't know why I hesitated. Maybe because some ghost deserved to stay silent. Maybe because I knew she wouldn't write unless she had something she couldn't text. When I finally unfolded the page, the smell of faint lavender hit me. The scent she always wore, the one that lingered on my old hoodie for months after she left. The letter was handwritten. 3 pages. Neat. Honest. She began simply, "Hi, Caleb. I don't know why I'm writing, except that I woke up last week from a dream where we were sitting on the fire escape of your old apartment, drinking cheap wine and talking about how to fix the world. And when I woke up, I realized I didn't want that version of you, or of me, to stay asleep forever." She wrote about Seattle, the art gallery she co-managed now, how she still painted in the early hours of the morning, barefoot and wrapped in mismatched sweaters. She told me her father had passed away last winter, and she didn't know how to process grief except to paint it until it stopped hurting. Then she wrote about us. "I've seen your name a few times, on LinkedIn, in passing conversations with friends still in Austin. Everyone says you're doing well, that you blew up in the best way. I'm glad, truly, but I also wonder, are you happy? Not just respected, not just stable, but alive." That line hit me harder than anything Logan had ever said, because the truth was, I didn't know. I had built something steady, something honorable. I had led with integrity. But alive? That was different. That was Maya asking if the boy who once read Neruda aloud by candlelight still existed somewhere beneath the corporate armor. She didn't ask to meet. She didn't ask for anything. She ended the letter with a line that could only have come from her. "I don't want to go back. I just wanted to say thank you for the version of us that believed the world could still be kind. I hope, wherever you are now, you haven't forgotten how to be soft with yourself." I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a drawer I hadn't opened in months. Inside were old sketchbooks, a photo booth strip of us from that summer we got rained out at a music festival and spent the night dancing in a grocery store aisle, a receipt from a bookstore with her handwriting on the back. "Tell me one secret you've never told anyone, and I'll paint it." I sat there in silence for a long time. Work had given me purpose, but somewhere along the way, I had stopped asking if it gave me joy. I had surrounded myself with systems, calendars, productivity tools. I had learned how to lead teams, how to negotiate with boardrooms, how to fight for people who didn't even know someone was in their corner. I had become strong, but Maya's letter reminded me of something I hadn't considered in months. When was the last time I let myself be vulnerable without strategy? That night, I didn't open my laptop. I took out an old notebook and started to write. Not emails, not transition plans, just thoughts. I wrote about the feeling of rain on my skin the night I left Centricore for the last time. I wrote about the first time I held a promotion letter and felt nothing. I wrote about the silence of my apartment, about the books I kept buying but never finished, about the idea that maybe success had become a disguise I wore so long I'd forgotten what my own voice sounded like. I didn't write back to Maya. Not yet. But I wrote to myself, and that felt like a beginning. The next morning, I walked into the office and did something unexpected. I canceled all my meetings for the day. Instead, I called my team into the open space and said, "Today, we're not going to talk about deadlines or metrics. I want to know what inspires you, what you do when you're not here, what lights you up." At first, they blinked at me like I'd lost my mind. Then Priya smiled. "I bake," she said. "On weekends. Cupcakes mostly." It started as stress relief. "I make short films," Ravi admitted. "Low-budget sci-fi stuff." Theo raised his hand. "I write fan fiction. Don't judge." We didn't. We listened. We laughed. We remembered that beneath the Jira tickets and sprint boards, we were still people. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir inside me. Not productivity, not pride, but joy. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was finally asking better questions. Because I was starting to remember who I was before the corner office, before the politics, before the war with Logan, before I learned how to weaponize silence and diplomacy and calm. And maybe that was the real letter Maya had written. Not a message to rekindle anything, but a mirror, one that showed me how far I'd come and how much further I still had to go. A week after Maya's letter, ARR. Subject, Confidential Executive Opera. The sender was Lucinda Grant, Senior Director of Executive Talent at Vanguard Tech. I opened the email with no real expectations. I wasn't actively looking. I was leading a thriving team, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was doing work that day. But as I read the job description, Positai, Global Expa, Compens, nearly TR, Oversight. This wasn't just a job offer. It was an INV of Globa. I read it 3 times, then closed my eyes. And in my mind, one question surfaced with terrifying clarity. If you accept this, will you still be yourself? That evening, I walked home alone instead of driving. I left my phone in the office. No headphones, no podcasts, no noise. Just the sound of my footsteps and the wind weaving through the city's concrete veins. I thought about everyone on my team, Priya with her deep, steady gaze and the uncanny ability to read code like it was poetry. Ravi, who once told me, a good engineer knows when to build. A great one knows when not to. And Theo, the fanfic writing prodigy with a DevOps brain wired like a conductor's. I thought about our lunchtime debates over system architecture, the laughter echoing in meeting rooms, the Friday bagels, the way we protected each other's capacity when things got hard. I thought about the thank you card from a small client in Ohio. We're not your biggest account, but you made us feel like we mattered, like we were your only one. And I thought about the reason I left CentriCore, not just because Logan failed us, but because I had once forgotten how human the people behind these screens really were. And then I thought about Vanguard, the skyscrapers, the global strategy maps, the boardrooms speaking 3 languages, influence, prestige, recognition, and distance, not just geographical, but emotional distance, from the team I built, from the culture I fought for, from the principles I'd spent the last year reclaiming. I knew deep down if I took this job, I'd have to leave CyberCore, leave the team, leave the very foundation I'd rebuilt from the ashes of my last burnout. Not because I'd betrayed it, but because I couldn't take it with me. The next morning, I printed the offer. Holding paper in my hands always helped me think more clearly. I sat alone in a glass conference room overlooking the city as it stirred awake. And then, something strange happened. I smiled, not because I'd found an answer, but because for the first time in my career, I realized I wasn't choosing to rise. I was choosing to stay. I had once believed that holding a title meant power, but now I understood turning down a title to protect your values. That's real power. I drafted my reply. Polite, clear, undeniable. Dear Ms. Grant, thank you for the extraordinary opportunity. It is an honor to be considered. However, I must respectfully decline. I'm currently building something I believe in deeply, and for now, that is where I belong. Best regards, Caleb Monroe. I hit send, stood up, walked out, and joined my team's morning sync as if it were any other day. No one in the office knew I had just turned down a 7-figure offer. No one needed to know, because real values don't exist in what you gain. They live in what you're willing to walk away from. That weekend, I went to a secondhand bookstore and picked up a leather-bound journal. On the first page, I wrote one sentence. Keeping promises to yourself is the hardest choice, but the most beautiful one. I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I do know this. I've been ambitious to the point of exhaustion, stood at the edge of forgetting who I was, and pulled myself back. Not flawless, not triumphant, but clearer than I've ever been. It started with a question. Theo had stayed late after a final sprint review of the month, hovering by the whiteboard as the rest of the team filed out. I was packing up my laptop when he finally spoke. Caleb, he asked, do you think this gets easier? I mean, being in tech, being good at it, staying sane while you're trying to keep up with everything. I looked at him, his face still young, but tired in a way that was all too familiar. Not from the code, but from the pressure. The quiet weight of constantly trying to prove you belong in a room that keeps shifting the rules. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked over to the window. The skyline blinked back at me in a hush of twilight. I remembered being his age, sitting in a different office, staring at someone else's back, waiting for permission to speak the truth out loud. No, I said finally. It doesn't always get easier, but you get stronger and smarter. And if you're lucky, you find people who teach you how to stay human inside the system. He nodded slowly, like he wasn't sure if that was comforting or terrifying. That night, I couldn't sleep. Theo's question kept looping in my mind, echoing not just for him, but for every young engineer I'd ever worked with. The ones who burned out quietly, the ones who left the field entirely, the ones who stayed and became shadows of themselves. Somewhere along the way, the industry had stopped mentoring. We had optimized performance, but forgotten to pass down wisdom. We had no elders, no flame keepers. So I decided to change that. We launched the program 2 months later. We called it Flame Keepers. Not mentorship, not leadership development, just a space, a circle. 4 engineers, designers, product people, anyone in tech, to gather once a week and talk. No agendas, no slide decks, just questions that mattered. What does success mean if it costs you your weekends? How do you stand up for a teammate without setting yourself on fire? How do you walk away from something that looks perfect on paper but feels wrong in your gut? Each session had 2 co-hosts, one senior, one junior. Everyone listened. No one dominated. We told stories about bad bosses and brilliant collaborators, about the first time we shipped something that mattered, about the day we realized a promotion wasn't the finish line. By the 3rd week, we had people from other departments asking if they could join. By the 2nd month, we were recording the sessions, just audio, just for internal use, and archiving them as a growing library of experience. We weren't building resumes. We were rebuilding culture. And the wildest part? No one asked us to. There was no KPI, no budget line, just a shared need to make the tech world feel less lonely, more human, to remind people that it was still okay to care, to still believe that progress could be powerful and kind. The invitation came on a Wednesday morning, buried between calendar reminders and sprint status updates. It was an email from someone I didn't recognize, Samantha Chun, Director of Organizational Learning at CentriCore Technologies. I stared at the subject line for a long time. Invitation to speak, CentriCore Ethics in Tech Seminar Series. My first reaction was disbelief. My second was nothing, just this quiet, cold blankness in the pit of my stomach. I clicked. The email was brief and formal, but carefully worded. Samantha explained that CentriCore had launched a new internal initiative, an annual seminar on ethical leadership in technology, born out of what she called a renewed commitment to integrity and transparency. She said the series was aimed at current employees, especially managers and new hires, to spark honest conversations around trust, burnout, and responsibility in high-performance environments. Then came the ask. Given your known history and impact during your time with the company, your name has come up frequently as someone whose voice would bring meaningful insight. We understand the complex nature of this request, and we extend it with full respect for your decision, whatever it may be. There was no pressure, no flattery, no attempt to rewrite the past. Just a simple question between the lines. Would you come back? Would you speak? I closed my laptop and walked away. That night, I made dinner without checking Slack. I poured a glass of wine and sat on the floor beside Professor, my cat, who blinked at me like I was making his evening unnecessarily complicated. I didn't tell anyone about the email. Not Darren, not my team, not even Maya, though she and I had recently started exchanging letters again. Not romantic, just honest. Real. Like 2 people who had once known each other at their most raw and still chose to be kind. I couldn't sleep. The idea of stepping back into CentriCore, even virtually, even as a guest speaker, felt like walking into a house that had once burned down around me. I had escaped. I had healed. I had built something new. Why go back? But deep down, I knew why it mattered. Because there were still people inside that system who hadn't escaped yet. Because silence had its own consequences. Because the younger version of me, sitting in that tiny cubicle wondering if he was going crazy, had once needed someone to say, "You're not imagining it. You're not alone." Maybe I could be that voice now. 2 days later, I replied, "Dear Samantha, thank you for the invitation. After some thought, I've decided to accept. I'd like to speak candidly, without censorship or corporate edits. If that's acceptable, I'd be honored to contribute. Best, Caleb Monroe." She responded the same day, grateful, gracious, clear about the boundaries and openness they were aiming for. The event was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. Virtual, 90 minutes, hosted on a platform CentriCore now used for all-hands meetings. They had titled the session, The line between pressure and harm. Lessons in leadership. Subtle, careful, but honest. When the day arrived, I wore a black button-up shirt, simple and sharp. I cleared my desk, turned off notifications, lit a small candle by my window, not for atmosphere, but as a reminder to stay grounded. The seminar began on time. Samantha introduced me briefly, skipping the corporate fluff, just mentioning my role in the past and my current work with Cybercore. Then the screen was mine. Over 300 people were on the call. I took a breath, and then I told the story, not with vengeance, not with bitterness, but with truth. I spoke about that Friday morning when Logan handed me a list and told me I was lucky to still have a job. I described what it felt like to look at names I had worked beside for years, names now erased with the stroke of a budget cut. I spoke about silent toxicity, the kind that doesn't scream or swear, but chokes you slowly with impossible expectations. About leadership that wears a smile while slowly bleeding its team dry. I spoke about the moment I realized I wasn't going to quit, and the choice to fight differently. I didn't name names, but everyone knew. I talked about accountability, not as punishment, but as reflection, as the decision to stop pretending that numbers justify everything. I talked about power, and how, if you're not careful, it rewires your empathy. I saw the chat light up in real time. People typing things like "thank you," and "this resonates so deeply," and "I thought I was alone." I ended by saying this. If you're leading a team right now, ask yourself one question. Not, are we hitting targets? Not, are we delivering faster than Q2? Ask, are my people afraid of me? Because if they are, that's not leadership. That's trauma in a tie. And then I close with a line I hadn't planned to say, but found its way out anyway. The best leaders don't just create outcomes. They create oxygen. And the real legacy isn't in the product. It's in how many people still breathe easier because you were in the room. There was a silence. Then applause. Virtual, of course. Emoji reactions. A wall of thank yous. But it wasn't about that. It was about knowing that the building I had once left in flames now had a fire alarm system. After the seminar, I sat by the window and watched the light change on the buildings across the street. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt released, like a knot in my chest had finally come undone. That night, an unexpected email landed in my inbox. This one was from someone named Marissa, an associate PM who had just joined Centricore a few months ago. She wrote, "I wasn't here when everything happened, but I'm glad you came back to speak. It gave me hope that this industry doesn't have to break us to build us. Thank you for being brave first." I replied simply, "You're the one continuing it." That's the real bravery. It was a Sunday morning in early spring when I realized I didn't want to build another company. Not really. I had just come back from a hike outside Austin, the kind that clears your head without demanding anything in return. The city was soft with early sun, and I sat by the window of my apartment, sipping coffee and staring out at the skyline. Everything felt still, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to chase anything. Not another role, not another title, not even another win. I just wanted to build something that would outlive me, not in a way that had my name carved into it, but in a way that carried forward the values I had bled for. Something that would grow quietly, like roots beneath a forest, unseen, but holding everything together. That's when the idea began to form. I didn't want a legacy tied to a product. I wanted a legacy tied to people. That week, I carved out time, real protected time, to think. I declined meetings. I delegated. I turned off Slack notifications and set my phone to do not disturb. And I started to write. Not code, not strategy decks, but ideas. A framework, a vision. What if there was a space, not a school, not a corporate seminar, but a living, breathing ecosystem designed to mentor, support, and grow ethical leaders in tech? Not just founders, not just top talent, but the people in the middle, the ones who carried most of the weight and received the least protection, the ones who burned out and never told anyone, the ones who stayed quiet to survive, the ones who wanted to lead but didn't want to become the very thing they feared. I called it the long game. It began as a Google document, just thoughts, then turned into a small slide deck, then a one-pager manifesto, And then one afternoon, I shared it with Priya and Ravi. We sat in the corner booth of our usual cafe, laptops open, noise all around us, but that kind of noise that fades when you're locked into something that matters. They read in silence. When they finished, Ravi leaned back and said, "You're not just building a model. You're building a movement." Priya nodded. "This is powerful and rare. People are hungry for this." I expected encouragement. I didn't expect commitment. But by the following week, both of them had offered to help. Theo joined the week after that. We started small. Monthly roundtables, workshops on value-centered decision-making, case study discussions, not about billion-dollar exits, but about quiet ethical stands, the kind that never make headlines but define careers. We invited speakers, not just success stories, but scar stories. People who had walked away, people who had fought and lost, but held their integrity like a flame that couldn't be blown out. We didn't measure attendance. We measured return. How many people came back? How many brought someone with them? How many stayed after to keep the conversation going in the parking lot? By month 6, the long game had grown beyond us. We had a mailing list, a volunteer group, a content hub where people could submit essays anonymously, reflecting on the parts of tech we rarely say out loud. We started getting messages from people we'd never met. A senior product designer in Toronto wrote, "I used to think I was alone in thinking leadership could be kind. Thank you for proving otherwise." A QA engineer in India sent a note. "Our culture doesn't always allow for these conversations, but your work gave me language I didn't have before." It was working, not because it was polished, but because it was true. And as I sat with all of it, the messages, the stories, the people returning week after week, I started to see something I'd never seen clearly before. Impact isn't in what you build. It's in who you build up. One night, while reviewing some testimonials for our upcoming community showcase, I stumbled on one that made me stop completely. It was unsigned, just a single sentence, submitted anonymously. I was planning to leave tech this year, but this space reminded me why I came in the first place. I read it again and again. Then I closed my laptop, leaned back in my chair, and let the silence wrap around me like a warm tide. That was the moment I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. Not climbing, not fighting, but planting, teaching others how to hold the torch without burning out, how to challenge broken systems without breaking themselves, how to play the long game, the one that chooses people over pressure, clarity over chaos, meaning over metrics. Months later, at one of our private sessions, Theo spoke up during a Q&A. "Caleb," he said, "if you had to start all over, no connections, no title, no credibility, what would you do first?" The room went quiet. I thought about it. Then I answered. I'd find one person I believed in, and I'd tell them, "You don't have to do this alone." That's where it begins. That's where it always begins. Not with scale, not with capital, not with going viral, but with witnessing someone's worth before the world does. That's the long game. It's slow. It's thankless. It doesn't trend, but it transforms. And it lasts. Not because we shouted the loudest, but because we kept the light burning. Even when the room went dark, there comes a time, after the momentum, after the applause, after the wins and the walls and the wars, when you no longer hear the noise, not because it's gone, but because something inside you has gone quiet. That moment came to me in early autumn. The mornings were cooler. The air had that crisp, dry edge that made everything feel just a little more still. Leaves scraped the sidewalks in slow spirals. The sun arrived late and left early, like even it had decided to rest. I had just wrapped the 6th consecutive month of the long game running at full stride. New programs, new partners, dozens of stories, conversations, moments that reminded me again and again that this work mattered. But something else had begun to stir inside me. A silence. Not boredom. Not burnout. Just stillness. The kind of stillness you don't notice until you realize it's the first time in months you've noticed anything at all. It came to me one evening as I sat on my balcony, mug of tea in hand, watching the lights flicker in the distance. I could see the outline of the city breathing beneath me. Cars in slow motion, windows flickering like blinking eyes, the low hum of everything moving. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to chase it. I just wanted to be. The next morning, I called a team meeting. Not to make an announcement, just to talk. I stood in front of them, Priya, Ravi, Theo, others who had joined later, and I said something I hadn't said out loud before. I think it's time I stepped back for a while. The words landed gently. No gasps, no panic, just understanding. A silence full of respect. I'm not disappearing, I added quickly. I'm not resigning. I just need a season to breathe, to reflect, to ask myself what comes after building. What happens when the fire is lit and others know how to tend it without you? Ravi smiled. That's not absence, Caleb. That's trust. Priya added. You've already taught us how to carry this. You stepping back doesn't weaken the flame. It honors it. I felt something catch in my throat then. A warmth, a gratitude, maybe even a kind of peace I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. We set a timeline. I'd hand off day-to-day responsibilities over the next few weeks. I'd remain available in the background, mentor, advisor, occasional sounding board. But mostly I'd let go and let them lead. The first morning of my sabbatical felt surreal. No morning stand-ups, no Slack messages, no urgent emails, just quiet. I made a slow breakfast, walked without headphones, sat in a bookstore for 2 hours flipping through pages I wasn't being paid to understand. At first, the stillness felt unfamiliar, like I'd stepped out of rhythm with the world. But soon, I began to hear something else beneath it. My own voice, not the professional version, not the mentor, not the builder, not the speaker. Just Caleb, the boy who once scribbled poetry in the margins of CS textbooks. The young man who used to stay up until 3 a.m. trying to build a calendar app that nobody would ever use, not because it was marketable, but because the process felt like magic. I began to write again. Not emails, not strategy decks, just words, thoughts, observations, small things that had gotten lost in the blur of doing. A conversation I'd overheard between 2 elderly women at the park about which bird had the most dignified posture. The way the barista at the cafe said, "Good morning," like it actually meant something. The memory of my father teaching me how to change a tire in the rain, cursing every bolt, but never once letting me see him give up. I filled pages, not for publication, not for performance, just for myself. As the weeks passed, I traveled a little. Not to speak, not for panels, just to see. I visited small towns where no one knew my name, sat in back pews of churches and libraries, watched people who weren't trying to become anything, but simply were. It humbled me. How much of the world ran on quiet people doing honest work without ever calling it a brand? I thought a lot about impact, how it isn't always loud. Sometimes, impact is a child watching a parent show up, consistently, imperfectly, lovingly. Sometimes it's a colleague remembering how you made them feel safe in a meeting that could have gone the other way. Sometimes it's an empty chair you once filled with dignity, and now someone else sits there a little taller because of it. One evening, while walking through a forest trail in Oregon, I stopped to catch my breath. There was no signal, no people, just the rustle of trees and the hush of something ancient moving all around me. I sat on a fallen log and closed my eyes. And I asked myself a question I hadn't dared to ask in years. If no one ever clapped again, would you still do this? The answer came, steady and quiet. Yes, because the work was never about being seen. It was about seeing the broken things and not looking away, seeing the lonely ones and walking beside them, seeing the system and still daring to hope it could be more. And yes, seeing yourself, not just as the one who carries the weight, but as someone worthy of being carried too. When I returned to Austin 3 months later, I didn't resume my old role. I didn't need to. Priya had stepped into leadership with grace and clarity. Ravi had taken over strategy. Theo was mentoring new engineers like it was second nature. They didn't just keep the fire burning. They made it brighter. And me? I took a small office on the top floor, tucked away behind a sliding door that didn't always close right. No title on the door. Just one word, printed on a small plaque Theo had made as a joke. But we kept it anyway. Caretaker. And that felt right. Because the quiet season hadn't ended. It had simply become a rhythm I would carry with me, long after the spotlight moved on. The idea came quietly, like most important things do. It wasn't a strategy session. It wasn't part of any 5-year plan. It wasn't even something I had written down. It came one evening, sitting at the edge of the office rooftop garden, watching the sun dip behind the city skyline. The air smelled like lavender and distant rain. There was a breeze, soft but certain. The kind of wind that reminds you seasons are shifting whether you're ready or not. I had just wrapped up a one-on-one conversation with Theo, who was now mentoring 2 interns and juggling his first team-level sprint leadership. He'd said something that stuck with me. I wish I could have met the version of you that went through it all. Not the one who tells the story now, but the one who lived it. Raw, confused, still figuring it out. And I realized there were so many people like him. People who had heard fragments. People who had felt the ripple, but who had never seen the circle. The people who made it possible. The ones who helped carry me, shape me, challenge me, and stand by me even when I didn't know I needed them to. So, I decided to bring them together. Not for a panel, not for a press release, but for a fire circle, a night, a room, a gathering, to tell the story behind the story, not just through my voice, but through ours. The invitations were handwritten, not formal, not elaborate, just one sentence. You were part of the fire that kept me going. I like to gather around it together. I sent 12. To Maya, to Darren, to Ravi, Priya, and Theo, to Trisha, Ian, and Mel, former teammates at Centricor, to Julia, my first manager back when I was still trying to understand what it meant to be more than a worker, to Mr. Jacobs, the community college professor who once told me, you don't have to be brilliant to lead. You just have to be brave enough to care in public. And to Samantha Chun, the woman from Centricor who had invited me to speak during the Ethics in Tech seminar. The one who believed that broken systems could still grow roots again. They all said yes. We held the gathering in a quiet retreat space just outside the city. Nothing fancy. A converted barn with warm lights, mismatched cushions, and a small fire pit in the center of the room. The kind of place where stories didn't need microphones to be heard. Everyone arrived just before dusk. We hugged, laughed, caught up like old friends, even if we hadn't seen each other in years. No agenda, just time and fire. We sat in a circle. The flames crackled low in the center. And after a while, I began, not with a speech, but with a memory. I was 29, I said, when I walked into an office and was told I'd be doing the jobs of 3 people who were just laid off. I said nothing, not because I agreed, but because I didn't know yet that silence was its own kind of participation. There were nods. Some knew the story. Others had lived their own version of it. Then Maya spoke. I remember getting a voicemail from you that week, she said. Your voice was calm, but it sounded like someone standing in a burning house, convinced they could hold the roof up alone. Laughter, soft and knowing. Darren chimed in. I remember telling him he should quit. You didn't listen. I did, I smiled. Just not then. One by one, people shared their side of the journey. Trisha recalled staying up late to help me draft that transition analysis. I wasn't angry that I got laid off, she said. I was angry that no one acknowledged how much we mattered until we were gone. Ian, always the quiet one, spoke slowly. The day you sent that email to the board, I felt like someone turned the lights on in a room I thought was just a hallway. Even Samantha shared. I joined Centricor after the fallout, she said. But your story? It became a compass. People whispered it like a myth. And I thought, what if we stopped whispering and started changing? The circle was quiet then. Not heavy, just full, like the space had caught its breath. Later that night, as the fire burned lower and our voices grew softer, Maya turned to me and asked, do you think it was worth it? I knew what she meant. The pain, the fallout, the weight, the sacrifice. I looked around the circle, at the faces of people who had carried me through chaos, who had lit torches for my flame, who had built things from the ashes not because they had to, but because they couldn't unsee what they had seen. And I answered honestly, yes, not because of what I built, but because I stopped pretending it wasn't broken. That's what changed everything. Not perfection, not plans, just the decision to stop lying to myself. To say this hurts, to say this matters, to say I'm still here. As the night ended, we each placed a small stone near the fire pit. Nothing ceremonial, just a symbol, something that said, I was here, I carried the fire too. No one gave a speech, no one filmed anything, We didn't need to capture it, because some moments don't belong to the algorithm. They belong to the soul. Later, as I packed up to leave, Darren slapped me on the back and said, "You do realize you've created a cult of emotionally intelligent technologists, right?" I laughed. "Not a cult," I said. "Just a circle." He paused, then nodded. "Yeah, a circle that'll outlast you." And in that moment, I realized that was the whole point. Not to be remembered, but to remind others they're not alone. To build something that keeps others warm, even after you've stepped away from the flame. The office was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that didn't come from absence, but from presence, the way libraries are quiet, or forests, or early morning kitchens. Not empty, just settled. I sat alone in the caretaker office, that small room on the top floor with a slightly crooked sliding door and windows that looked out over the city. A city that had raised me, tested me, and, in many ways, healed me. The sun was setting behind the skyline, casting long gold shadows on the walls. I had a single envelope on my desk. No branding, no signature, just a name printed in my handwriting, to whoever comes after. It wasn't a resignation letter. It wasn't a manifesto. It was a continuation, because I had come to understand something deeply, irreversibly true. You never finish this kind of work. You just carry it for a while, and then you pass it forward. In the months since the fire circle, something in me had shifted, not in a dramatic way. I didn't burn out. I didn't crash. I simply felt full, like I had said everything I was meant to say for this chapter. And so, without an announcement or ceremony, I began preparing the handoff. I met with each team lead, not to delegate, but to listen. I walked the floor more often, not to supervise, but to witness. I spent more time in mentorship sessions and fewer in strategy meetings. And slowly, with intention, I began to step aside. Not because I was leaving, but because I wanted to make space for what came next. Not for me, but for them. The letter I was writing wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to hold space. A quiet note, left in a drawer for the person who would one day sit in this chair and look out this same window and wonder, like I once did, how do I do this without losing myself? So I wrote, "Dear you, if you're reading this, it means the torch is now in your hands. First, let me say, you've earned it. Whether you feel ready or not, whether you're full of fire or full of doubt, this role didn't come to you by accident. Leadership is rarely loud. The best of it happens in whispers, in the way you listen when someone is afraid, in the way you choose patience when urgency tempts you to rush, in the way you hold your ground when ethics and efficiency clash in the dark. There will be days you wonder if it matters. I won't lie. Some days it won't feel like it does. But here's the truth I learned. If you help even one person feel less alone in this work, you've already changed the system. Build what you must. Break what you must. But never forget this. The people are the product. The culture is the legacy. And kindness is not weakness, it's strategy. I love no playbook. You don't need one. Just light the next fire. With hope. Caleb Monroe. I folded the letter gently and slipped it into the drawer beneath the desk, where the next caretaker would one day find it. And then I looked around the room one last time. Not with nostalgia, but with gratitude, because I had not done this alone. This story, my story, was never really mine. It belonged to every intern who asked hard questions, to every manager who chose compassion over convenience, to every teammate who stayed late not for points, but for people, to every quiet voice that found its volume and changed the course of a team. They were the fire. I had only tended it. That night, I left the office with no fanfare. No farewell post. No big announcement. Just a walk through the dusk, past familiar sidewalks and newly built towers, knowing that my work wasn't finished, just transitioning. And when I got home, I opened the window wide, let the city breathe through the screen, and sat with a new journal on my lap. A blank page, not for a new plan, but for a new season. I didn't know exactly what I would do next, but I knew how I'd begin. By listening again, by paying attention to the quiet, by showing up where I was needed, even if no one was watching. Because some fires aren't meant to go viral. They're meant to stay lit in the background. Steady, warm, waiting for the next soul who needs to remember they're not walking through the dark alone. This was not the end. It was never supposed to be. It was just my turn to step back from the flame and let someone else step forward. Every story is meant to be continued. Now it's yours. What will you build? What will you burn? And who will you walk beside when the fire gets low? Take your time, then light it, and begin. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own quiet fire or of someone who once helped you carry it, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who needs to feel seen. Leave a comment and tell us, what fire are you carrying right now? Subscribe to follow more stories that remind us. Leadership isn't about power, it's about presence. Because every time you choose people over pressure, kindness over control, and integrity over convenience, you're lighting the next fire. Let's keep it burning together.